statement from Buckingham Palace confirming that the Duke of Edinburgh has died.
The husband of Queen Elizabeth, the Duke of Edinburgh, a fixture of British life for decades, has passed away.
Because we have just learned from Buckingham Palace that Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 99.
The devotion between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. She used to refer to him.
Much more on that breaking news this morning, the death of Prince Philip. The husband of Queen Elizabeth passed it.
We don't know any more detail on that for you yet. We will bring that to you.
Away from the crowds at the castle, in the heart of Windsor Great Park, the bell...
Today, military guns will fire salutes and sporting events will pause for minutes of silence.
Coronavirus restrictions, the country here in the UK is still under a strict lockdown. Things will definitely look a little...
aloof royal family and more of a family that was just a family.
Passed sooner than anyone would have hoped.
He was hospitalized, I remember, he was hospitalized for a while, and then he was released.
So it's going to happen, but you are never really ready, the Princess Royal wrote. My father has been my teacher.
It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen has announced the death of her
Queen.
It was Philip, apparently, who encouraged the Queen to make that famous speech celebrating.
And in 1979, his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was killed by the IRA in County Sligo.
Death of a prince, the tributes to Prince Philip, and the condolences to the Queen.
He's been at Queen Elizabeth II's side for decades, and today Prince Philip made his final solo public.
There was a small white card, handwritten, edged in black, tucked into a wreath of white lilies and sweet peas that sat on top of Prince Philip's coffin as it made its way through Windsor Castle on April 17th, 2021. Cameras caught it. The world saw it. And for a moment, just a moment, the most guarded woman in the world let something slip. What she wrote on that card has been debated, misreported, and quietly misunderstood ever since. Some outlets said it was formal. Some said it was intimate beyond anything the public expected. The palace said nothing. They called it private. And in the absence of an official statement, two competing versions circulated, one clinical, one heartbreaking. And nobody could say with certainty which was true. But royal historian Hugo Vickers, a man who spent 60 years studying this woman, who met her personally more than 40 times, who drew on sources closer to the palace than most biographers ever get, has now confirmed what that card actually meant. And it's not just about the words. It's about what those words reveal about a marriage, a woman, and a grief that the Queen carried completely alone. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe to Royal Archives. Because here's what most people still don't understand. That card wasn't a formality. It wasn't protocol. It was the only goodbye she got. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what April 9th, 2021 actually looked like inside Windsor Castle. Philip had been unwell for weeks. He'd returned from King Edward VII Hospital in mid-March after a month-long stay, his longest hospitalization in decades. The official line was a heart condition, an infection. What Vickers now confirms in his book is that Philip had been quietly managing inoperable pancreatic cancer since 2013. 8 years. He'd been diagnosed at 91, told the prognosis was serious, and characteristically said almost nothing about it to anyone outside his closest medical circle. The Queen knew, of course, but the wider family? Staff recalled a careful, deliberate silence around the diagnosis. Philip didn't want it discussed, didn't want it to change how people looked at him or treated him. So the public decade of his retirement and his last years at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, his quiet withdrawal from royal duties in 2017, was shadowed by something the world was never told. By the morning of April 9th, the end was close. Philip got up. He had a bath. He told staff he didn't feel well. And then, before the Queen could reach his bedside, he was gone. That detail is the one Vickers lingers on, because it wasn't the first time. Throughout their marriage, the Queen had asked staff to let her know when Philip was leaving a room, leaving a building, leaving for an engagement. She wanted to say goodbye. And time and again, according to those close to the household, she'd be told, His Royal Highness left 20 minutes ago. He moved at his own pace. Always had. It was one of the quiet rhythms of their marriage, his restlessness, her quiet wish to hold the moment a little longer. On the morning he died, that pattern played out one final time. He left before she could get there. He left, as Vickers puts it, without saying goodbye. The funeral was 8 days later, 30 guests, no congregation, no eulogies. COVID restrictions had reduced one of the most significant royal funerals in living memory to something almost unbearably small. The Queen sat alone in her pew, black mask, black coat, black gloves, separated from every member of her family by the 6 feet that the rules required. No one could sit beside her. No one could hold her hand. Charles was across the aisle. Anne was further back. The grandchildren were scattered at careful distances, watching a woman they had never once seen cry sit completely still in a chapel built for ceremony. What she carried into that chapel was a grief that had no public outlet. The monarchy doesn't grieve publicly. Not really. There would be no breakdown, no visible collapse. 70 years of training doesn't disappear in a moment of loss, but those who watched the footage closely, and millions did, in living rooms across Britain and America and Australia, noticed something that no protocol could fully conceal. She was utterly, completely alone. And the chapel around her, designed for exactly these moments of national mourning, had never looked quite so incapable of offering comfort. The grandeur of St. George's Chapel, its vaulted ceiling, its banners, its centuries of royal history, framed a woman sitting by herself on a wooden pew in a mask with 6 feet of empty space between her and the nearest member of her own family. And she had prepared one thing of her own for the service. Not something the protocol required, not something the palace arranged on her behalf. The wreath was her choice. White lilies, white roses for Philip's birth month of June, sweet peas as a symbol of departure, wax flowers for lasting love, jasmine threaded through the whole arrangement. She had selected each element herself. Every flower carried meaning she had chosen deliberately, and she had written a card. The card sat visible on the coffin as it moved through the castle on the specially converted Land Rover that Philip himself had designed 18 years earlier. Camera lenses caught it at angles. Lip readers and photo analysts studied the image for days afterward. 2 versions emerged from that scrutiny, and they told very different stories about what the Queen had felt in the hours after her husband's death. 2 things were eventually confirmed. At the top of the card, the words, "In loving memory," and the signature. Not Elizabeth, not the Queen, not even her formal name as the world knew it. Lilibet. That word is where Hugo Vickers focuses, and where the real story lives. Lilibet is not a name Queen Elizabeth chose for herself. It came from childhood, from a small girl who couldn't quite pronounce Elizabeth, and turned it into something softer. Her father, King George VI, used it first. Close family followed. And Philip? From the earliest days of their courtship, in letters written during his naval postings, when they were continents apart, used it as his private name for her. Not Her Majesty, not the Queen. Lilibet. Vickers has documented the letter writing between Elizabeth and Philip in careful detail. Their courtship was conducted largely on paper. He was at sea, she was at the palace, and the correspondence went back and forth across years before they were even publicly engaged. He called her Lilibet, she called him Philip. It was, in the most literal sense, how they knew each other before the world got involved, before the institution got involved, before the weight of the crown made every word carry consequences. By the time she placed that card on his coffin, they had been exchanging letters for nearly 8 decades. The correspondence had outlasted wars, coronations, the collapse of the empire her grandmother had ruled, and the reinvention of the monarchy itself. Through all of it, through the public crises and the private arguments and the long arc of a shared life, the letters continued. The last one she ever wrote him was the one the cameras caught, sitting on white flowers on a converted Land Rover, moving slowly through Windsor. It was signed with the name he had always used for her. That's not a formality. That's not protocol. That's a woman writing to her husband exactly the way she always had. right to the very end. And Vickers confirms something else about their private correspondence. Philip kept her letters, every one of them. Staff who had access to his private quarters at Wood Farm noted the care with which his personal papers were organized. The letters were there, decades of them, preserved with a precision that reflected how much they mattered to him. He kept what she wrote to him, every single one. And on the day they buried him, she wrote to him one final time. There's a reason the palace called the card private. And it's not just about protecting the Queen's grief in the immediate aftermath of loss. It's because the card exposed something the official narrative of the royal marriage had spent decades carefully managing: the gap between what the public saw and what was actually there. For most of the Queen's reign, the Elizabeth-Philip marriage was presented in one of two ways. Either it was a flawless partnership of duty and shared purpose, two people who had sublimated everything personal in service of something larger, or, in more skeptical quarters, a cold arrangement between two very different people who happened to be bound by the same institution. The truth, as Vickers builds it, was neither. Philip was difficult, brilliant, restless, impatient, and not always easy to live with. He had opinions the palace found inconvenient, a bluntness that occasionally embarrassed the institution, and an independence that chafed against the particular kind of deference his role required. He was the one man in Britain expected to walk behind his wife in public for 70 years, and he did it, but it cost him something real. Those who observed him closely across the decades saw a man who carried that sacrifice with discipline, but not without strain. What Vickers makes clear is that the Queen understood that cost. She saw it. In private, away from the cameras, there was a warmth between them that the formal occasions rarely showed. Staff recalled a particular quality to the evenings at Windsor in their later years, the two of them sitting together quietly, no performance required. Philip with a book or a glass of beer, Elizabeth nearby. The room settled around them in a way it never quite did on public occasions. The card was signed with the name that belonged to those evenings, not the monarch, the woman. And yet, here's the detail that cuts through everything else. She sat alone at his funeral, unable to say goodbye in person, in a chapel full of people who couldn't move close enough to comfort her. The card was a correction, a final act that undid the pattern that had repeated across their entire marriage. He had always left without saying goodbye. This time she made sure she got the last word. Across royal history, notes left on coffins have carried extraordinary weight. When Princess Diana was buried in September 1997, her son William, just 15 years old, left a single word on her wreath: Mummy. It stopped the world. The Queen would have known that tradition intimately. She had stood at enough royal funerals to understand precisely what a handwritten note on a coffin communicates to those watching and to the person receiving it. She chose Lilibet. She chose in loving memory. She chose those words, in that order, in her own handwriting, on her own stationery, edged in the black of mourning custom. Philip had spent a lifetime moving fast, leaving before she could catch the moment. On April 17th, 2021, she put something on his coffin that would travel with him all the way. In the months after Philip's death, the Queen rarely spoke publicly about her grief. She made one remark that stayed with people, describing his passing as having left a huge void, quiet, understated, characteristic. But those 3 words, coming from a woman trained across 7 decades never to expose her interior life in public, said more than most eulogies could. Vickers, who observed her across 6 decades and spoke with people from within her household, writes of a woman whose emotional depth was consistently underestimated by the public image she projected. She felt things fully. She expressed them selectively. And the people closest to her, the staff, the aides, the household who saw her before the cameras were switched on, knew the difference between the Queen and Elizabeth. The card was Elizabeth. What Vickers has confirmed is not just the text of a handwritten note. It's the final piece of a private language built between 2 people who constructed something real inside a very public institution. a language that started in letters written across naval postings in the 1940s, that continued through 73 years of marriage, through crises and celebrations and the long quiet of old age, and that ended, on her side at least, with a white card edged in black, signed with a name the world wasn't supposed to know. She never got to say goodbye in person. He left before she reached him, so she sent the letter anyway. The way she always had. The way she always would. What lingers about this story, and why Vickers' account carries the weight it does, is what it reveals about the distance between public image and private truth at the heart of the British monarchy. The Queen spent her entire reign managing that distance, keeping things contained, presenting the composed, unreadable face that the institution demanded of her from the moment her father died in February 1952, and she became Queen at 25. It was her greatest discipline, and in many ways, her heaviest burden. Philip understood it because he lived it alongside her every single day. They were, for 70 years, the only people in each other's lives who fully grasped what the institution required and what it extracted in return. Nobody else was close enough to both sides of that equation. Nobody else had stood inside it long enough to know. The card is a window into that. Small, handwritten, black-edged, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. And the name at the bottom, Lilibet, is the quiet answer to the question that followed the royal marriage for decades. Was there something real behind the duty? Behind the protocol and the managed distance and the 70 years of walking in formation? One word. Her answer. She signed it Lilibet, and as the monarchy moves forward, as a new generation of royals navigates an institution that looks very different from the one Elizabeth built her life around, that card remains one of the most honest documents the modern royal family has ever produced. Not a speech, not a statement, a note. Private, personal, signed with a childhood name. The full story of what their marriage was, behind the processions and the protocol, is still being understood. Vickers has given us one piece. It may be the most important piece of all. If this kind of carefully researched royal history is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed to Royal Archives. There is much more still to uncover.